Well, welcome everyone. Welcome again. Welcome back. This morning we're going to continue on to our reset, I call it, or back to the basics. You know, every once in a while it pays to go back and review the basics and understand where we are. If you've ever participated in anything that was a skill-based activity, whether it be playing a sport like golf or tennis or flying an airplane, riding a motorcycle, anything that's based on skill, there's a couple things that are true. I don't care what the activity is, there are a couple things that are always true about it. And one of them is that you have to do it on a regular basis. If you don't do it on a regular basis, you kind of lose some of what you had, When I was flying, sometimes I would get busy and I couldn't go for a couple months. And then I would go out to the airfield and get in the plane, and we would go up. And I wasn't as skilled as I had been the last time I flew. I lost some of it. Some of my practice, some of my skill was gone. And I was spending time just kind of getting back to where I was. The same thing with playing golf. If you don't play on a regular basis, or tennis, or anything that you do that's a skill. So we want to kind of remember then that what we are trying to do here is we are trying to motivate ourselves, encourage ourselves, inspire ourselves to uncover within our own consciousness that passion to continue to discover the presence of God within. Going back to the basics helps refresh that, helps us to be reminded anew. Things that we know, things that we thought we knew, things that we may have forgotten or may have kind of gotten covered up in the busyness of life. The other thing about skills that I've learned is that sometimes when we're not performing the skill to the level that we desire, we have to go back to the basics, and we have to ask ourselves, have I let kind of a bad habit creep in? If we're playing golf, have I changed the grip that I've learned? Am I doing something differently? Let me go back, and this is why we hire coaches in sports. We hire a coach because a coach can observe our behavior, and a coach can point out to us the things that we are doing that we are not aware of. We're doing them, but we're not doing them consciously. And the coach can say, why are you holding the racket that way? Why are you holding the club that way? Why are you doing this? Let's go back to the basics. Here's the stance. Here's the grip. Here's the swing. Here are the fundamental things that you have to have. Because if you don't have the fundamentals down, it's like having a shaky foundation for a house. Look at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The foundation wasn't set on solid ground. The building is magnificent, but it's in danger of falling over. So going back to the basics every year is a way of kind of shaking up our thoughts, shaking up everything that we believed, everything that we thought we believed, calling it into question, challenging ourselves. What do I know? What do I think I know? How do I know what I know? What do other people think about this? How do I know if what they think is right or wrong? And ultimately, how am I going to know for myself? That's the most important question when it comes to spirituality. How are you going to know for yourself? As the mystic Osho tells us, that which we call religion is our belief in somebody else's experience of the divine. That's what religions are based on. Think about that for a moment. Think about all of the great world religions. And they all start with somebody having had this experience. Similar experience, mystical experience. Moses had the experience of the burning bush, the fire that burned but did not consume, which was a metaphor for the mystical experience. Right? Similar with Elijah going to heaven in a chariot made of fire. Consumed in the mystical experience, consumed in the mystical experience. Jesus lived the mystical experience, the experience of being one with the Father. Paul had a mystical experience, was knocked off his horse on the way to Damascus. Whether these things literally happened the way that they're described is not, to me, not as important as the fact that they are describing an experience, and out of that experience religions are built. Muhammad had an experience of the angel. Joseph Smith founded Mormonism. He had an experience of the angel. See? So all of these things that we call religions, kind of organized dogma, creed, traditions, ways of believing, all of these things are tied into someone else's experience. And that's what religion is. But spirituality is having our own experience. And the first question we want to consider when we come back to the basics is, what is your goal here? We set New Year's resolutions. Yeah, I don't set them anymore. But people set New Year's resolutions, the things that they want to experience or things that they want to accomplish during the year. And what is it that we want to experience in our religious life, in our spiritual life? Are we satisfied with taking someone else's word for it? Satisfied with listening to someone else's experience? Or do we really desire to have that experience for ourselves? Is that what we're really after? I attended a workshop with a man one time, and he was talking about, somebody asked him about things today and things that the way they were during the 60s, during the civil rights movement. This man was a leader in the civil rights movement. And he told a little story. He said, he says there's a barnyard. He says there's a chicken yard. He says, and every Sunday, he says, all the chickens get together. He says, and one of the roosters gets up on the top of the hen house and starts preaching a sermon and tells all the other chickens about how wonderful it was when chickens could fly. He says, and all the chickens, even though they've got wings themselves, they all stand around and say, isn't it wonderful that chickens used to be able to fly? Now his meaning, of course, was he felt that today people needed to be more active rather than just sit around and talk about things that happened in the 60s. But it's kind of the same idea when we get to religion and spirituality. We all have wings. We are all the spirit of the divine incarnate. We did not create this life. It created us out of itself. We are little sparks of the divine. The poet says we are a spark that we can desecrate, which we do. We cover it up with our humanness, but we can never destroy. And what we're all seeking, what I'm suggesting, is that what we are all seeking is the experience of that spark. That's what we're really after. It's no longer good enough for us to listen to somebody else tell us, well, this is what it's like to have the experience. This is what it means to have the experience. That's wonderful, but that's their experience. What's your experience? What's my experience? And what are we willing to do in order to prepare ourselves for that experience? So that's why we go back to the basics. What is our passion? What is our desire? What is our commitment to know this thing called life? Whatever it is. Dr. Holmes says, the thing itself. Well, why does he call it the thing itself? Why doesn't he just use the word God like everybody else uses? And he's challenging us to think, what do we really mean? What do we really mean when we use the word God? What does it really mean? We can use the word God in a room of 1,000 people and there'll be more than 1,000 understandings of what that word means. But when he says the thing itself, now we've got to stop and say, well, what does he mean by that? See? Instead of saying, oh yes, I know exactly what that means. I know what the word God means. I know exactly what that means. Now we go back to the thing itself, and we got to say, well, wait a second. What does he mean by that? Why did he choose that word? What is he trying to get to here? And I think he's trying to get us to think. What are we thinking about? How do we think? What is it that we are thinking with? You know, I look at our our view of science, and I love science. I loved science as a kid. I loved Mr. Wizard. I don't know if you remember Mr. Wizard as a kid. Loved doing the experiments, you know. One time I took an empty medicine bottle that had an eyedropper on it, and I filled the eyedropper with vinegar, and I put baking powder in the bottom of the bottle, and screwed the top on, and squeezed the vinegar out, and then tightened it as tight as it would go. And that little rubber piece of the eyedropper got as big as a balloon before it blew up and made a mess in the kitchen that I had to explain to Mom. I loved experimenting. I loved investigating things. And the older I get and the more I look, the more I realize is that we in what I will call the Western world, we have spent the last 1,000 years or 500 years at least looking at what we can weigh and what we can measure and what we can touch and what we can feel. And we have spent very little time investigating what is it that's doing the looking. What is it that does the looking? What is this thing called consciousness? What is this thing called mind? You know, if you and I look at the same color, do we see the same color? Do we see different colors? Do we interpret things differently? What is this consciousness that is doing the interpretation? And isn't that perhaps more important than what we're looking at out there? Is what we are looking with from in here. So Dr. Holmes, when we go back to the basics and he starts right out with the thing itself and then the way it works, you know, what is this thing? What is this creative energy? Is there a creative energy? And if so, what is it? And how does it work? And then how do I fit into that? Is it something out there far away and I'm over here? Am I its victim? You know, did it create me and put me here to suffer, to be sick, to be poor, to punish me, to teach me a lesson, to give me a pass-fail test that if I fail, I'll have to suffer forever and ever and ever? And he's inviting us to go to the one place that we can go. See, there's only one place that each of us can go to find our answers, and that's within. That's within. Even if we try to interpret an answer that someone else gives to us, something that we read in a book or something that we hear in a Sunday talk, even if we try to interpret that, we are interpreting it within our own consciousness. The only things that we know within our own consciousness. Even the things that we touch in the physical world, and we're not feeling them out in the physical world. We are interpreting that feeling somewhere in our consciousness. Somewhere our nerves carry an electrical impulse, and that impulse, excuse me, goes into our brain, and then somewhere in the brain, it somehow gets tapped into consciousness. I was reading something during the week, and I haven't investigated it to see if it's true or not, but it's interesting. It's interesting. And this is what I'm talking about, curiosity. Are we curious about God, is what we talked about last week. But it was looking at evolution, and it was looking at it just from the point of view of the adaptation of the species to the environment. And what the author was claiming is that at some point in evolution, what happened is the capacity of the brain became much greater than what was needed for survival, right? So if you think of evolution as survival of the fittest, you can think of everything as being a reaction to some kind of an outside stimulus, and it's a reaction that helps the species to survive. But then all of a sudden, there was this increase in brain size, which the author was equating to an increase in ability to think, that went much beyond that which was required to survive. Why is that? What happened? Why would life, if life's purpose is to survive, from the evolutionary view, if life's purpose is to survive, why would it need a creature capable of thinking more than is necessary? And I'm laughing because I think sometimes we're our own worst enemy. We think more than we need to. So all I'm getting at is all of these questions are fascinating questions. We need to go back to the basics and not get settled in our ways and say, oh yes, I know the answer to that. Oh, I know the answer to this. And yes, I've studied that, and I've read that, and you know, this is what Jim told me. And none of that's good enough. See, none of that matters, because in the end, what matters is, what do you know? How have you investigated? How would you know? These are the kind of things that we challenge ourselves to do when we go back to the basics. So we start in the chapters. Remember I said last week, it starts with curiosity. If you're not curious about it, it doesn't matter what books are put in front of you, what's available on the TV, what you hear on a Sunday. It doesn't matter, because it's just not going to be of any interest to you. So we have to start with curiosity. We have to start with awakening our curiosity, our natural curiosity. The curiosity that we had as children, you know. Think of that little preschooler who's just driving everybody crazy with asking why. What is this? Why? They're just, you know, question. And that's the way we ought to be when it comes to exploring God, exploring our ideas about God, you know. Here we are. Here, think of how magnificent this is. We are on this tiny speck of rock that is flying around a nuclear furnace 93 million miles away. It's spinning on its axis. It's moving in its orbit. The very sun that we're orbiting is moving in its trajectory through the galaxy. The galaxy is moving through its trajectory in the universe. The universe is perhaps just one of many multiverses we don't know. It cracks me up every time I hear the reporters say, you know, the Hubble telescope has been improved and scientists can now see to the edge of the universe. Really? Really, they can? What's going to be there? A big sign? Big sign that says, caution, universe ends here? Come on, give me a break. Think about what they're saying, you know. How magnificent is all of this? And yet we are here and we are able to think about it. We are able to ask, how did this all get here? Where did this all come from? Why is this all here? Is there a purpose to this? Or is this just some kind of a chemical accident? You know, is life a chemical accident? Are human beings nothing more than a chemical accident on this planet? Did brains enlarge as a result of a chemical accident? All these questions that we have to start to ask ourselves. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And I think the wonderful thing about it is we can do it and we can actually be fascinated by it. We can be enthusiastic about it. We can be enthralled by it, you know. When I was a child growing up, the questions, we were given answers, you know. I mentioned this last week. We were told, this is the answer. This is the answer that you want. Remember that answer. It's going to be on the test, you know. And some of the questions didn't have answers. And the answer to that was, well, it's because we said so. It's because we, the authority, said so. And you just have to take that as a matter of faith. And what we're saying now is, explore that. What are your unanswered questions? What are the things that you wanted to know? So Dr. Holmes gives us some ideas, and I want you to consider these chapters. And I hope that after you get off the call today, that you'll break out your copy of the textbook and you will read the second chapter of the introduction, the way it works. It's very short. It's less than 10 pages, I think, but it's powerful. It's power-packed, you know. I went and looked at different creation myths of the world, and if you're interested, you can just go on the internet and you can type in what are the creation myths of the world, and you will get lists of them, you know. As I mentioned in the email last night, there seems to be four mythologies that are common to cultures across the world. Now, I'm not saying that they each explain it the same way. What I'm saying is they each address an important question in their mythology. And the first one is, of course, where do we come from? What is the creation myth? Where did we come from? It's amazing how many different societies, when you go and look at them, that we're told that their name for their society is the original people. We are the original people. Everybody else comes second. We're the original ones. We're the chosen ones, so to speak. But the cultures have a creation myth. They have a myth about where food came from, how food came to them from the gods, where fire came from, fire being a gift from the gods or was discovered on the mountain where the gods lived, those kind of things. And a flood myth. These are the four myths that are very common in different societies around the world. And if we go back and we look and we say to ourselves, well, there's this question, see, there's this unanswered question that we want to explore. We're spiritual explorers in the uncharted territory of mind, is what Dr. Holmes tells us. How did we get here? Why are we here? What is this thing that people talk about called creation, you know? If we look at it, we can say, well, what did other people look at? What did other people think? And if you go and look at these creation myths around the world, now, of course, you have to understand, we don't know who wrote these down on the internet. We don't know when they came into being. We don't know if there's, scientists would call cross-contamination, like if, for example, creation myths is recorded of the Plains Indians in the United States. Were they influenced by the early missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries from France who came down the Mississippi River with the fur traders? Was that kind of influence? But if we look at the different ideas, some of them are more metaphysical than our own ideas. Some of them say that God created itself out of its own thoughts. God created itself out of it. Of course, they've got a different name for God, you know, but their idea of God created itself out of its own thoughts. One thing I want to mention is that these mythologies are so similar in some cases that when the Spanish first came to Central America and Latin America, of course they brought the priests with them, right? The church the Pope was giving them permission to go out and to explore the world and convert everybody to their idea of religion. So the missionaries came with them, and they became exposed to some of the ideas in the native religions. And they were so astounded by the fact that the ideas in the native religions were so similar to what they believed in their version of Christianity, that they started to assume that after the resurrection, Jesus came to Latin America and taught the people in Latin America before the ascension, between the resurrection and the ascension. It's because the ideas were so similar. See, perhaps Carl Jung would say, you know, we all are part of the collective consciousness. And the ideas and the symbols that come up in our dreams are similar. And the same symbology exists across different cultures. And if you're interested in that, read his book on, I think it's called Man and His Symbols. Carl Jung, he wrote it in 1954, I think, just before he passed away. There is something within each and every one of us. You see, there's something within each and every one of us that is telling us, hey, think about this. Come figure this out. Meister Eckhart says that God is like the child who clears its throat playing hide and seek. Come find me, here I am. And there's this beautiful presence within us, within all people of all times, that has been crying out to be discovered, and each culture has been trying to address it, each in its own way. And when we come down to it, they say it began with thought. It began with thought. And this is what Dr. Holmes is telling us to consider, or asking us to consider. Theology will tell us that God is spirit, and what is spirit but consciousness that is without form. Now later on we could argue that consciousness always cloaks itself in form, But the way that I take it is the consciousness precedes the form. That which is before thoughts, but from which thoughts come. That which is before words, but from which words come. There's this thought. In our culture, we draw heavily from the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, the creation story. And even with that, I want to caution you, you can take different groups of people who all look at that same story and walk away with different understandings. The important thing is, what's your understanding? What does it mean to you, and how do you know it, and how are you going to prove it to yourself? Can you prove it to yourself? But we're told in the beginning was the void and the chaos, and this is referred to as chaos theory of creation, and there are many creation myths that creation started from chaos. Right? Everything wasn't like it is now. It was all kind of twirly and dark and without form. And then the Spirit moved upon it. See? The Spirit of God moved upon it, said, "Let there be." Spoke its word. Spoke its word. Now, does it have vocal cords, this thing called spirit? Does it really speak? What language did it speak? You know, I get a kick out of all of the ghost hunter shows where these people go all around the world looking for exotic haunted places, and somehow the ghosts are always just speaking English. I haven't quite figured that out. But that which is spirit is pure consciousness. Consciousness is awareness. Consciousness is that which is aware. And it is pure consciousness aware of itself. This is what the Buddhists call the blue light consciousness. If you practice the yoga of dreams and sleep, you can experience the blue light consciousness while your body is asleep. Pure consciousness aware of itself. This is kind of the ultimate idea of what God is. Pure consciousness aware of itself. Pure thought. And it thinks. And its thinking is what is referred to as this speaking of let there be. Since it doesn't have body, it doesn't have vocal cords, this idea that it's speaking is not speaking an audible sound, but a movement of thought upon itself, a movement of consciousness upon itself. I think that's Holmes' definition of thought. Thought is a movement of consciousness upon itself. What thinks? Consciousness thinks. What becomes aware of the thought? Consciousness becomes aware of the thought. When I sit and I meditate and I'm trying to just do something as simple as count from 1 to 5 over and over and over, and all of these thoughts start intruding in my meditation, who's thinking those thoughts? Where are they coming from? You know, coming from consciousness. What is observing those thoughts? Consciousness. And what is consciousness? And what is my consciousness? But at the very beginning of the creation stories, if we look around the world and if we look at what Dr. Holmes is telling us, this thing itself is consciousness. It is thought. And the way it works is it creates by thinking. It creates by thinking, and that is represented in our book of Genesis as God said, "Let there be." It creates by thinking. In one of the Hindu mythologies, the creator is sitting on the back of a turtle, and it opens its eyes and the universe is created, and it closes its eyes and the universe goes away. The creation. Without arms and legs and hands and feet and hammers and nails, how does it create? How does the invisible energy take form? How do the galaxies form? How do the stars form? How do things come to be? And there's something that moves upon the energy and directs the energy to take form. Quantum physicists are looking for, I think it was the Higgs particle, the God particle. I can't think of the proper name that they're looking for. Is there a particle, an as yet undiscovered particle, that somehow this particle tells the energy to take form? And that would be an explanation of how it works. But why? Why do things take form? Why does energy become matter? Why does matter take shape and form and exist in form for a period of time? And then why does it give up that form and go back into energy? And we're told by the law of conservation of energy that energy can be created or destroyed. It just is, and it changes form. And why? Why is that so? Is this energy that we are talking about, is it some aspect of the thing itself? Is it some aspect of God? We get into really deep questions in physics. Was the energy there before the Big Bang, or was there no energy before the Big Bang? Does the energy come into being and then take form? Does the energy go out of existence? All of these deep questions make us kind of ponder the mysteries that let us understand that wow, there's something more fantastic than science fiction can dream up. There's something more fantastic than the greatest scientific minds we know can understand. And we are part of that. So how does this thing create? How does it work? And Dr. Holmes tells us, it is consciousness, and we for the sake of helping us to understand, right, we divide it up into categories. We say that there is conscious awareness, and then there is subjective awareness, the subjective mind, or the subconscious mind, as people call it. Not unconscious, because it is conscious, but it is subjective in that it only does what it is told to do. It acts as a blind law, a blind force. So when the conscious awareness part of spirit, when it says, let there be, the subjective part takes that as a command and does whatever needs must be to cause the energy to take form, causes the form to, to create galaxies and planets, etc. And we would see then that creation is a movement of thought upon itself, but there is something that responds to that thought that then brings it into a physical reality. Kind of the simplest explanation that I can give, yet it is completely profound. It would make us go, what? Huh? But we go back and look at the creation myths of the world, some of which are thousands of years old, and people who had a lot more time to think than we do have arrived at the same conclusions. That which is beyond thought, but from which thoughts come, created itself out of its own thoughts, created all of creation out of its own thoughts. So we say, well, when did it begin? We can look at planet Earth, and we could say, well, planet Earth, it came into existence about 4.8 billion years ago when the galaxy was forming, and all. Okay, well, then what was before the galaxy? What was before the universe? What created all of these things? And eventually we get to a point where there is this thing itself that just simply is. It has no beginning, it has no end, it does not exist in time or space. And that is, it's not limited by the definition of time or space, but it created time and space. And this is where the idea of omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence comes in. The different theologies will look and say, what is this thing? And they will say, well, it is all powerful, it is all knowing, it is everywhere present. And Emma Curtis Hopkins would challenge us and say, no, that's not what it is. That's how it expresses itself. It is even beyond that. It is even beyond that. So where we want to come to today, we want to think, first of all, remember the quote that says, do not bother seeking God unless you are seeking as earnestly as you would seek a pond if your hair was on fire. These questions are deep, and these questions are consuming. These questions are the most important questions we will ever ponder. And the only place we can find the answers is within our own consciousness. We may read and study, but we're going to have to interpret them, and we're going to have to be still and sit and listen. Who am I that God is even mindful of me? It has created me out of itself because it has created everything out of itself. And why did we have this kind of step function in evolution, if in fact there is one? We have this step function where suddenly the capacity to think exceeded the necessity of survival. And Thomas Troward would tell us that the purpose of evolution, physical evolution as we know it, if we look at it, that at every increase in evolution, every phase that evolution goes through, there has been two characteristics: a greater sense of movement and a greater sense of intelligence. That if we look back, we just take a big step back and say we start with a single-celled animal living in the ocean all the way up to the greatest whale, to the elephants, to the humans. At every step of the way, from the single-celled animal to multi-celled worms, for example, in the ocean, to plants on the shore, to reptile, every step of the way, as life is evolving, it is evolving to something that has a greater degree of mobility and freedom. Single-celled things just float in the ocean, fish swim, that kind of thing. To something that has a greater capacity to think. And when Troward looks at that, he says the purpose of it being evolution, the purpose of it was to create a being capable of recognizing its oneness with the divine life. That's you and I. That's you and I. We have this thing called consciousness. We have the ability to think. And we are capable of realizing that we are one with God. We are its creation. And what Troward tells us, he says, this is the fifth dimension. This is the fifth dimension. We go through the mineral, we go through the vegetable, we go through the animal, we go through the human, and now we are becoming the spiritual, the spiritual. And when we reach this point in evolution, any further growth, any further change requires on you and I to consciously cooperate with that same power, that same law that the Creator itself uses, the power that responds to us according to our beliefs. See, the divine can't doubt. When God says, let there be, part of God doesn't say, really? You think that could happen? No doubt. Speaks its word, believes its word, something acts upon the word, and it is. We are created in that image and likeness. That same law of mind, we call it, responds to you and I as we believe. It is done unto you as you believe. And what Troward is telling us then is that any further evolution on the part of humanity into the spiritual realm requires us to consciously cooperate with that law. In other words, we have to stop acting at the physical level. We have to stop believing at the physical level, and we have to step into our spirituality. In biblical terms, we have to cast off the old Adam. We have to put on the new. We have to put new wine in new skins. We can't put it into old skins. We've got to completely change the way we're thinking. And we've got to step into the fullness of our spiritual being. So now we have this premise, right? We have this theory, if you want to call it that. We have this premise that we live in a spiritual universe. We are spiritual beings. We live in a universe that responds to thought according to belief. And how would we know that? How would we know that? See, we don't want to just hear it. We just don't want to nod our head yes to it. We just don't want to feel good about it. We want to know it. And the only way we're going to know it is by experiencing it. That's the only way we're going to be sure. Because up until the time that we can use it, we don't know it. We know about it. I liken it to learning how to drive when I was a teenager. You know, I love to do research and I love to read. And when I got my permit and was going to take driver's ed, I read everything I could about driving cars and, gas pedals and brake pedals and steering wheels and shift levers and turn signals. And I knew everything there was to know about driving a car. That is everything I could get my hands on about driving a car. But it wasn't until I got behind the wheel and the driving instructor told me to pull out into traffic on Queens Boulevard in New York City, which is a very busy thoroughfare. It wasn't until then that I started to experience it and know for myself and take these things that were only ideas and start to experience them in my own way, in my own reality. So what we're being invited to do this year, and again, I encourage everyone to please read chapter 2 of the introduction to the textbook, because I'm talking about it. I'm not reading it to you. I'm talking about why the ideas in it are important. And what it is challenging us to do, what Dr. Holmes is kind of tickling our curiosity with, is how does God work? What is this thing called God? That was the first chapter. What is it, And how does it work? Holmes tells us if we come across an engine, we know that there must be an engineer. And by engineer, he means someone who designed and built the engine, not the person who drives the train. We come across this magnificent universe. We come across this magnificent body that God gave us. Every day is a miracle. We take different foodstuffs in, and somehow the intelligence in our body absorbs from that exactly what we need and eliminates that which we don't. Every day we're living in this magnificent, magnificent experiment. And we have to awaken to it. We have to pay attention to it. We get so caught up in counting the trees that we lose sight of the forest, What is this thing called life, and why are we part of it? Why did it create us out of itself? We're going to talk about that more next week. Why did it create us out of itself? Why does it need us? Does it need anything? Does it need us? Does it want us? Would it create something it didn't want? These are deep questions. So what I'm suggesting today is the premise that you're working with, or that we are working with, is that there is a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief. This is in New Testament theology. This is believing in your heart that it is so and it shall be done. In Old Testament theology, it's as you think and believe in your heart, so it is. In Buddhism, we're told everything that you experience is a result of your thought. Change your thinking, change your life. What the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. All of these different ways are trying to say the same thing. Thought is creative. Thought is creative. And Dr. Holmes would tell us that controlled thought is more creative than uncontrolled thought. The only way you're going to know this for yourself is to try it for yourself, to become a scientist, to develop an experiment. And what that means is you're going to have to learn what belief is. And how do I develop belief? Can belief be developed? Can faith be developed? Or is faith something you either have or you don't have? What are thoughts? What is consciousness? If it's done unto me according to my belief, is my belief everything I think? Or is it something deeper than that? What is faith? So you see, the experiment then leads us into a deeper exploration, and a deeper exploration of this thing called life, of this thing called God, of this thing called us. But we must be willing to explore. We must be willing to create that experiment within our life so that we can test changing our beliefs and observe the circumstances in our lives changing. Okay? The way it works, that Dr. Holmes puts out, is it creates from thought. part of it acts upon that thought and acts as a blind force, as law, bringing into actual experience the very thing that it has declared, let there be, and it is. It has created us out of itself, and that law works on us as well, all the time, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not. So our challenge now is to choose deliberately and to choose wisely and to observe our thoughts. To decide what we're going to believe in and what we're not. To toss out the things that no longer work for us. To develop an understanding of what consciousness is, what faith is, what belief is, and how we develop it. Choosing something we wish to experience in our lives and then working on developing that faith until it makes its demonstration. And then we will know. Then we will have had the experience. Then we will not be taking anyone else's word for it. We will be taking our own word. So I invite you this year, I know we talked about some deep things today, and the whole purpose is just to awaken within us a deeper desire to know God, a deeper desire to ask, well, what are my own questions about that? We've heard the ones Jim tossed out, but what are my own questions? And what answers might exist? What other cultures might have tried to address these? And what's left unanswered? And how would I explore those answers myself? How would I determine what is true and what is not true? What is faith? What is belief? What is thought? And am I willing to find out? So I invite you then, go ahead and take out your textbooks, read chapter 2 of the introduction, the way it works. And next week we'll share more ideas, and we'll share more ideas around chapter 3, which is what it does. All right. Thank you for being here today.